Hello, critters, and welcome back to Gnome Soup, where we're busy dungeon crawling our way through philosophy, trying to find the tastiest recipes along the way. My name is Joey, and today we've encountered the great Wizard of Konigsberg, Immanuel Kant. Why don't we just go ahead and jump in, introduce ourselves, and say hi. What about you, Nicholas?
I am Nicholas and I like philosophy.
Hey, it's Eric, and I'm a great philosopher.
Hi, I'm the homeless guy that got off the street, Verity. I read a book once. That's about my my expertise.
Yeah. So I wanted to put this forward first. It's just kind of my primary stance, and I just wanted to be honest with all of you guys as to how I stand on Immanuel Kant before we go into him for an hour or two. But so for the last couple of months, we've been on the trail of Nietzsche, and Nietzsche's project is somewhat the mirror project of Kant's. I just want to get this out of the way so that we can fully engage with Kant's universe. But I don't believe Kant provides a true critique of metaphysics due to his lack of engagement with the values that motivate his project. I know that I start this off with a bit of swinging, and I just want to make it clear that I appreciate Kant in many ways, one of them being that I'm of the opinion that one doesn't simply see an object for how it is. I think that we regulate our experience through various fantasies and fictions, so we're engaging with those things in philosophy instead of like the actual object itself. As it pertains to ethical systems, I realize Kant's is notorious for being awfully rigid, but when compared to some of these classical like ethical systems like utilitarianism and such, personally I'm a big fan. All the time Kant was going off on the shiftiness of happiness due to being centered on shifty objects, I was cheering. I think Kant and I are aligned with this idea. I'm primarily thinking of John Stuart Mill's idea of competent judges, which I found rather revolting, but for different reasons than Kant's. One more shocking way in which I aligned with Kant was in the practical necessity of freedom. It wasn't that long ago where I was saying pretty much the same thing as Kant concerning freedom. Since we act as if we have freedom, we are justified in believing we have it. To me, I thought that it doesn't really matter if the world was metaphysically determined or not. The fact was that we acted as if it did exist. Perhaps I have a certain affinity with Kant because I believe I understand the place he's coming from. But all of that aside, at the end of the day, Kant still seems to devalue and empty the world in favor of a world beyond this one. And to me, it seems like his critique is against the way, the method with which philosophers have justified this ontological valuation, rather than taking a hard look at the values that give rise to this metaphysics in the first place. Although I do kind of just want to get this out of the way, because I want to immerse myself more fully into his world and engage with him on his terms. I just want to be honest with you guys concerning my position, and I'm curious to know what your guys' general positions are on Kant.
Hello, this is Eric again. I would consider myself to be a Kantian, or however you pronounce it in English. Yeah, that's more accurate. Kant is a more accurate pronunciation of his name, yeah. But I, as a Kantian, I think what he says is essentially accurate. One of his basic ideas is that space and time are brute facts. They're objective aspects of human perception, and I would agree with that. And also his notion of categories, this idea that we combine things by putting them in categories. I would agree with that idea, and I would also agree with the idea that
Not the aces.
I know. I would also agree with the idea that there is no inclination that makes us moral or good. It's not as if some people have the correct inclinations while some people have wrong inclinations. It's just we have respect for universal moral laws, and that's what makes us good. So, and the upshot of that is that when we say somebody does something good, we're not implying that they're a good person. We're just saying they're doing something good. We're acknowledging a fact of experience. We're not saying anything about their inclinations or their motivations. We're just saying that what they did is good, and we're showing respect for that. And we and from a Kantian point of view, we have an interest. We paradoxically have an interest in morality. This thing that's nothing within the world of sense because in the world of sense everything is about inclination and determination by physical factors. Somehow it generates an interest in us, and that doesn't motivate us to do what's right, but it's a bonus for doing what's right.
Joey, you said before something like Kant seems to devalue and empty this world for the sake of another world beyond that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To me, that sounds very Platonic, in which you have the world of matter for Kant, that's the world of sense, and for Plato, it would be the world of forms. For Kant, it's the world of understanding. The thing is, right now, as my position of metaphysics stands, I don't really know if there is a world beyond this one. I only know we're living in the world of experience right now, but that would be my initial position.
I guess that kind of makes me the somewhat of the outlier. I find that I'm more historically minded than other people, which means that generally if I'm to understand somebody's writing, I need to understand sort of the context of what they were responding to, and then specifically who responded to them. So when I look at Kant in this sort of lens, I find Kant to be sort of moved past. Nobody is really directly referencing Kant nowadays. However, if we were to look at him within the place of the history of philosophy, you cannot avoid Kant. Kant is essentially a massive flux point for modern philosophical discussion. And to put that in context, it's prior to him, it was generally the major flux point prior to Kant was Thomas Aquinas. So that is a massive scale of time for essentially a whole bunch of different ideas. The two biggest discussions at the time, obviously empiricism, rationalism. For Kant, this was Hume and Leibniz. Some people say Descartes, but Kant was actually only moderately aware of Descartes. He was actually far more aware of Leibniz as the primary rationalist, which he learned through the line of Christian Wolff. Both of which they disagreed on particulars, but when it came to ideas of space and time, those guys agreed. And Kant's doctoral dissertation was originally focused on criticizing Leibniz's ideas on rationality. Now, an interesting note within his career is prior to that, in 1770, when he produced that dissertation, he had written an essay a year, sometimes twice a year, while he was a student. At 1770, he stopped writing, and the next major publication he did, he wrote one essay within the span, but the next major publication was Critique of Pure Reason in 1781.
Yeah.
So he took an entire decade to essentially go, okay, I've put down the groundwork. The big reason for that is in 1771 or 72. There's kind of there's not a complete date of when he came across it, but he came across a translated work of somebody responding to Hume. So funny enough, he didn't actually have Hume's original treatise of human nature, but he got somebody responding to Hume who extensively quoted. It was something like more than 50% of the book was just straight up Hume.
Wow.
So that was where he learned about Hume.
Yeah.
And reading Hume opened up an entire line of discussion.
Yeah.
It was specifically, I did share in the chat, the Leibniz-Clark letters. Did you guys read those?
I didn't get the chance to,
Yeah.
but did you, Nicholas?
I got to read the first book, I think it is, the first book, the first reply, and the
Yeah.
second book.
Yeah, they were just letters back and forth. It was Leibniz was writing to a governess within England, and Clark was writing back. Clark was actually a friend of Isaac Newton.
Yes.
And this was a major scientific discussion that was happening at the time. Now, to be fair, the majority of the letters is a theological discussion over the God's
Absolute space.
Space is a part of it, but the primary point was the omnipotence of God, and more specifically, is the universe. Leibniz was a very big determinist in that he believed God was so powerful, the universe was set up, God doesn't need to touch it, because if he touched it, it was an imperfect creation, and God can't create imperfect things.
Yeah, for Leibniz, there was no winding the clock.
Yeah.
So,
And Newton's universal gravitation, his laws of inertia and momentum, the now 3 laws of motion that we know, as well as his optics, all suggested that the universe was not perfect, that it kind of loses energy over time, which introduced something new in physics.
Yeah.
and heat death.
Yeah. And it was essentially like physics hit a flux point. So Thomas Kuhn, which I know he's a pretty popular writer at U of U, if you guys have read him, he introduced the idea of paradigmatic shifts in science.
Yes.
Scientific revolutions.
Yep.
So Newton introduced sort of a paradigmatic shift.
Okay.
And Leibniz, being somebody who was right on that particular flux point for physics,
Yeah.
was essentially arguing for what was known prior to Newton's discoveries. Kant is very much, when you understand this, Kant is kind of a response to the change in physics in suddenly our understanding of inertia and momentum, because prior to it, it was people believed that objects were either in motion or in rest. They would naturally move towards one or the other. Newton introduced, no, actually, motion is weirder than that. Objects have a property that either keeps them in motion or keeps them at rest, depending on their prior state. And because of this shift in physics, very much philosophy had to shift and start to understand these other questions of like, wait, if we're talking about motion, relation of objects, universal gravitation and whatnot, how are we understanding these concepts of space and time? And that was the point that became more popular as time went on for those letters.
Well, you know what? One of the things you're talking about, the historical setting in which Kant is situated.
Yeah.
When it comes to that question, I can't help but think of kind of like the political turmoil that was occurring during his time, right? It was the blooming forth of liberalism. And one of the things that I once came across that never really struck me was the idea that Kant's entire project sort of like democratizes philosophy for, anybody has the chance to practice reason and thus be moral. But this is like in comparison to, you go back to the Greeks, and it's kind of like this Greek nobility and everything. The philosopher king, the one who is like most highly prized. It's not kind of this thing that, you cast your pearls before swine in. Yeah.
Well, Kant democratizes philosophy, but specifically practical philosophy. So the idea that each rational will is sovereign and they provide themselves with their own laws. That was a major idea of Kant. That's one of 3 principles in his ethics, and that brings us back to the groundwork. Is that he had these 3 principles that were interrelated. You had the categorical imperative. You had this principle that rational beings are ends rather than means, and then you have this principle that rational beings are sovereign and give themselves their values. And speaking of liberalism, if we go all the way forward to the 20th century, you have Isaiah Berlin, who was very inspired by this notion of rational beings giving themselves their own values.
Yeah.
And speaking of Isaiah Berlin, you said you were interested in like the history. Are you?
Off the top of my head, no. But possibly I've heard of one of his ideas. What do you work on?
He had this notion of negative liberty. So the idea of liberty is like people aren't oppressing me. But he had this other idea of like the difference between history and philosophy. So like the historian's role is to say how things are in the moment, and then the philosopher's role is to change things, to move them forward.
Yeah.
So there's a metaphor in the introduction to the sense of reality. It's a book I'm reading, where the historian says, "Here's the conditions of things at home," and the philosopher says, "Run away from home." That's the difference between history and philosophy. But to go back to what you were talking about, where there are these flashpoints. Is that the word you used?
I use the word flux because I tend to think of it as like a network. You ever play the Kevin Bacon game?
No.
Oh, the 7 rules of Kevin Bacon.
Oh yeah,
or the 7 degrees. Sorry. It's typically, if you name a movie, you can find within 7 movies,
right.
naming an actor, you can find a movie that stars Kevin Bacon.
Right.
It's also, you have the like Wikipedia game now, where you're given a Wikipedia article, you have to go through the links to find another Wikipedia article. It turns out when you actually like study networks and such, most things are actually connected quite well.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk about like connections, it's Kant. Actually, I have a diagram here. 'Cause I was thinking about this idea. It's sort of, if you have a network of concepts, it's usually thought of like this, where you have a bunch of points. Say if a group of Facebook people, they might have a friend that they connect to another friend. That friend might be connected to another friend. When you're talking about somebody like Kant, they're like a flux point in that you might have different connections here. But Kant was so influential at the time. He came up with such a good idea at the time that essentially the next wave of philosophers all kept referencing Kant.
Yeah.
And then you get to the point where everyone's referencing the people who reference Kant.
Yeah, you can't really get away from him.
You can't. So it's important to know, for me it's important to know Kant, but it's usually, if you want to know the actual ideas of Kant, it's, you're not dealing, his ideas were, there were like...
Of their time.
Yeah, he wasn't around for non-Euclidean space. At the time, he believed that...
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, when he was talking about space and time, he was talking purely in Euclid's precepts, which had held for thousands upon thousands of years. I think it was 1,500 years.
Like it's the non-Euclidean thing, and like whether or not that gets rid of his entire idea of space and time, because like space has properties if it's like relative. What was like Churchman's? I forget exactly how he went about it to say that this has usually been seen as like a good way to like overthrow Kant's idea of space being a mere intuition versus, you know, space having properties in and of itself. I know that there was a specific way that Churchman was going about that, but I do you happen to recall what that was?
I don't remember the Churchman reading.
Oh, okay.
We did. Joey and I took a class about the critique of pure reason, and there was probably a reading about Churchman and non-Euclidean geometry. I don't think it matters as a person with a mathematical background. I don't think it matters that he was there. He wasn't there for non-Euclidean geometry, because if you actually understand the development of non-Euclidean geometry, it's first developed when they realized that you couldn't derive. So Euclid had five.
Precepts.
Well, five. What's it called? Postulates.
Postulates.
He had 5 axioms overall, but each book he introduces sometimes other. Well, I don't think he has more postulates than the 5, but they realized that you couldn't derive the parallel postulate, which is the 5th postulate, from the other 4, and then from that, mathematicians developed all these different systems of non-Euclidean geometry. I don't think it matters that much. I think if you take Kant might have assumed that space is Euclidean, and he was wrong in that, but that doesn't mean that space isn't what he says it is, which is the form of outer perception, outer intuition.
I think it's that Kant was correct and incorrect, and it's both important and not important. So part of the problem of understanding Kant's concept of space is that it's both epistemology, but also ontology. And we can absolutely say his ontological judgment of what space is, in that it's infinite and Euclidean, it does not hold. Now that we know more about, the Minkowski space-time, and how it's hyperbolic, generally we can dismiss his ontological ideas on space, but when it comes to the epistemological, it's purely the idea that it's a priori, in that we experience space, but intuitively, if we're...
It's true of our experience, it's true of our perception,
Yep.
and it also precedes it and makes it possible.
Yeah, and absolutely everyone operates on Euclidean. No one's really, like, at the point... no one's sitting at a spot in the universe where they're experiencing hyperbolic space. Even if, like, right here in this room, there is technically hyperbolic. Every time we move, we're bending space. But we're so tiny in terms of space-time that it all operates as Euclidean. So when it comes to just sort of the idea of, like, I see an object across from me understanding space that epistemological, that's a priori, that's absolutely within what Kant was saying. I think he's 100% correct there.
And a contrast to Kant's view is going back to the Leibniz-Clarke correspondence.
Yeah.
You know, Clarke was of the view that space, you know, there is an absolute space. There is a big invisible container for everything where there's an absolute position. And that was a view he got from Newton. Whereas Leibniz was of the view that space is only relative, and that's a view that he got from Descartes, where there's not a space, there's spaces between things. You know, there's relative spaces between things, but there's not a space.
Yeah. And that it's specifically the mind creates the concept of space. Leibniz said that there was no empty space because space doesn't exist unless you can relate to objects.
Yeah, versus Kant, where space is absolute. There is a real container for everything.
Yeah.
But it's synthetic a priori. It's merely there to make perception possible, to make experience possible. Experience is a form of knowledge. So it's for all this, for Kant, for the Critique of Pure Reason, all these synthetic a priori things that he talks about are just there to make experience possible.
Yeah.
You know, which is a form of knowledge.
Yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was going to kind of get back to like the historical point at which he democratizes philosophy for rational beings, right? But I was also going to point out how there's like a this is a darker turn as well. It could be in that people who are outside of the kingdom of ends. They're kind of integrated in different ways, but and so like the idea of of reason seizing hold of the will, when this sort of idea is like integrated into the political, it's not without ramifications, and like. I still think of like philosophers today, like Nozick and Rawls, who famously like went back and forth discussing like one side of liberalism versus the other side of liberalism. Kant being like the huge inspiration from the origin from which both of these guys came from. And so I wanted to know what you guys thought about kind of this darker aspect of where people who are outside of the kingdom of ends are. Well, is it for their own good that they're brought into the kingdom of ends, like brought into this?
I don't know what you mean with people being outside the kingdom of ends, because I always conceptualize the kingdom of ends as this idea that if it were to be realized, no one would be left behind.
Okay.
So I would need more elaboration on what you mean with that.
Well, what I mean by that is like the people who practice like Kantian theory, and they have this certain notion of what it means to be good. But for those who would rather like dwell inside of the coming at it from Kant's terms, the sensuous and everything, like these putting it in kind of his own terms, they're unenlightened beings. But, the world is expanding, our kingdom is expanding. Welcome in.
I will note it might be a translational thing with Kingdom of It, because it's I know it's Reich in German, which could mean realm.
Okay.
So some might say it's the realm of ends, kingdom of ends. Like apparently there's some controversy on translating that.
Okay. But is that translation like really like substantial?
The weird thing about Kant, and I've heard this a couple times, is that the German is apparently harder to understand than the English. The original, he is notoriously weird with his original language.
Yeah. But I don't know. It's kind of like a darker turn. The thing about reason seizing a hold of the will, because you have to choose a master, and you can either be a subject and allow reason to align you with the good will, or you can be in the nature of objects and be tossed by every whim and inclination. And so to me, this is kind of the part of where Kantian ethics, when it's like very much merged with the political, it's a dark side, at least in my opinion. But I would just like to know what you guys if you guys have general notions about, Kantian ethics inside of the political.
I would say that every rational being, from a Kantian point of view, every rational being is part of this community of rational beings. The kingdom of ends is an ideal. So it's something that community of rational beings is trying to be.
Yeah.
But there's not anybody outside of the community of rational beings. There's not any rational being that's outside of that community. So in that sense, they're part of this. We're all part of this approximation of the kingdom of ends. So there's no outside and inside. And I was thinking about it because there was I think Raymond Sapolsky came out with a book recently about free will. And I think from a Kantian standpoint, we treat people, and also from Isaiah Berlin's standpoint, we treat people as having free will because we know they're rational. To treat them as not having free will would be to treat them as non-rational and therefore as non-human if we're talking about human beings. And that's not, whatever benefit theoretically we could get from treating people as not having free will or considering them as not having free will would not be worth treating them as non-human. Mm-hmm. And that's the problem with approaches to the problem of free will that just outright deny it.
Yeah.
Or try to say, oh, well, it's just irrational, it's just a leftover of an earlier time or an earlier ethos. And this gets us back into like philosophers being of their time.
Yeah. Right.
I think that philosophy is progress. That's the smallest unit of human progress. And as progress, we can look at it as progress rather than as a fixed flux point. So it's always worth it. Well, it's generally worth it to revisit. Figures like Hume and Kant are worth revisiting. Mm-hmm. They don't lose their timeliness. This old, it's like technology. It's like you can say, we've superseded it, or we've superseded the needs of it. The need for this, the felt need within society for this. But technology is human usable, and if you can understand it, it can be worth going back to in many cases, even old technology.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the reason why I mention it is exactly about this kind of timeliness of where philosophy, it sprouts out of the time in which it's integrated. And, well, you have liberal revolutions in Europe during this time, but you also have, a few happy-go-lucky ships going across the world, enlightening people. And so, to me, it's like a different side of the coin that should also be considered when we're talking about like when Kantian ethics. And you have some political guy who comes along and is like, oh, that's a good idea. Let's start making the kingdom of ends kind of like this ideal, like a material reality. That's where one could get nervous.
I'll add this is where some of my problems come in with Kant specifically, in that he is very much he's the type of person that tends to universalize everything. It's not just you're experiencing one. That type of person on Twitter you go to and it's like, oh, this is a bad event. No, it's the worst event in the world.
Right.
Like Kant very much feels like that when it comes to his sort of philosophical approach. You can especially actually, you guys went over the podcast with Nietzsche. You guys mentioned that there is sort of the pre-Zarathustra, the post-Zarathustra when it comes to Nietzsche. And what's fascinating is we actually have both of those. When it comes to Kant, there's the pre-doctoral and the post-doctoral. And all of it's connected. And you can see in the beginning of the Groundwork, he actually says, like, I wanted to get to my critique of pure practical reason, but I felt like I had to put this down and then later on get to a Metaphysics of Morals. So for him, all of these projects are connected.
Yeah, and may I just say, like, this is one way in which I kind of admire Kant. It's like it does seem it is kind of like he has a big project.
He absolutely was concerned with this very massive thing, because it wasn't just he wanted to explain one aspect in a book and kind of put it to the side. He very much started with epistemology,
Yeah.
kind of touched on, ontology was never really a purpose of critique of pure reason, but he kind of established a foundation there. Much of his stuff about groundwork comes from his works
I got you.
with the critique of pure reason. And his kingdom of ends, unfortunately, this is where I say that the universalizing, he's universalizing a moral category in very much the same way he tried to universalize epistemological ideas in what is a priori and what is not a priori, or a posteriori,
Yeah.
and more specifically what you can know and cannot know. The thing in itself continually pops up, which we've, thankfully that's another aspect of Kant that we've kind of moved past. The thing in itself.
But that whole idea of the thing in itself, that's his foundation for why we can say we have free will, is because we can divide the world into a sensible world and an intelligible world of understanding. And in that intelligible world, we can say, in the sensible world, we have these oughts. We have this, you ought to do this, you ought not to litter, you ought to recycle. And those are oughts in the sensible world. And then in the intelligible world, you can say, well, I will recycle and I will not litter.
Yeah.
And that's where free will is in this. I can think myself free, and that relates back to a reading that is part of the Cambridge edition of the works of Immanuel Kant, Practical Philosophy, that Nick, Joey, and I are reading. He has this review of a book written by a guy named Scholz, where he says, hence he always admits freedom to think, without which there is no reason. In the same way, he must also assume freedom of the will in acting, without which there would be no morals. So in that review of the book by Scholz, which was written in 1783, he's saying that we have freedom of action because we have freedom of thought. Yeah. And in the groundwork, he expands on that idea because we have this spontaneity of reason, because reason can think the wildest things. It can reason for Kant can come up with the wildest, metaphysical things that couldn't possibly exist in the world of sense, because that reason is free, and that's like freedom of thought. We have freedom of action in a sense.
Yeah, and just like very broadly, I correct me if I'm wrong, but this is kind of the big general way in which I think about the critique of pure reason compared to practical is that in pure reason, Kant is critiquing pure speculative reason, which claims to be like unbounded by anything. But Kant is critiquing it, saying you are bounded by the categories, you are subject to the understanding. But in practical reason, so far, it's not pure. It's still grounded upon these empirical inclinations.
The term that pops up a lot is imagination, and he borrowed that from Hume. Hume specifically brought up that when it came to rationalism, its greatest mistake was that people mistake imagination for being a real thought grounded in experience or something ontologically real. And that's specifically what he's critiquing in Critique of Practical Reason. It's like the bounds of imagination.
And it's like for practical reason, whereas he's saying it's been like chained to the contingent, in contrast to speculative reason, practical reason, you should be autonomous. You should be autonomous so that you can align yourself with the moral law, excuse me. So that's kind of generally how I view pure versus practical.
And well, to go back to the Kingdom of Ends, very much I feel like that is kind of a continuation when he was talking about the thing in itself, in that when you treat other people, it's very much, he was trying to figure out how do we deal with the relations of people in this categorical imperative, and it's you have to treat other people as if they are things in themselves. You can't know it in the same way that you can't really know a table, you can get the experience, but you have to treat it as if it has its own end. So when he talks about the Kingdom of Ends, I don't see that as dark. Typically, it's just more that you as a person, you are your own end.
Yeah.
You're not a thing I can use to sort of like a tool. Yeah. You're not a chair I can sit in. You're not a door I can open. You're a thing that operates on your own, which does tie into what Eric was saying about the free will.
I got
Yeah, that's one of his three principles. This idea of going back to what are the main principles of Kantian ethics. You have the categorical imperative follow laws that can be used that govern universally. Govern all of our conducts universally and consistently. So laws that we can all follow and that we can all follow consistently, which he says, we can all will. We can all say, I will do this at any time, and all of us can do this. And then we have the other statement, which is what Verity was getting at, where it's treat people like ends, or all rational beings as ends and not means.
Ends in themselves.
Yeah, ends in themselves. And he honestly, Kant gives a definition of end that is like, that's the end is the determining ground of a will. And when he says that a rational being is an end in itself, he's referring to, our will, our reason determines our will. We determine our will. We determine what we will do. Yeah. And that's why we're an end. And so he has that second principle. And then the third principle is our maxims or our laws we give to ourselves. So in that way, we're like a sovereign. So we make our own laws and we give our own laws. And as members of this kingdom of ends, we order each other around, basically.
Yeah. This kind of dynamic between where reason is both like it's the sovereign, but also the subject is is an interesting dynamic within Kantian ethics. It's you're autonomous, but as long as you're subject to the laws of reason.
I'll jump ahead a bit in time, actually, because we've talked a bit about the history. Yeah. I think that the branch that best captures what Kant is getting at here, when he talks about things like people being ends in themselves, or the kingdom of ends, and that everyone is cooperating in this sort of system, I actually find pops up in Heidegger's phenomenology, existential phenomenology, in that he specifically, which he learned from Husserl, and Husserl was specifically replying to Kant, in that he didn't agree with Kant's thing in itself, and he expanded into the intentionality, categorical intuition, life world. So he took a lot of the Kantian ideas, and then he expanded into more of a study into consciousness, such as it's now called phenomenology. Yeah. The study of how we deal with phenomenon, as Kant put up. But Heidegger then expanded into it, and it feels like he pulls a bit from Kant here, in that he talks about sein, Dasein, and I can't remember the third German word, but it's essentially being there, and then being there with others. The translation is a little weird. It's being there with others, or it could be being there with all. In that Heidegger puts, and a lot of people get on Heidegger and say, like, you don't deal with ethics. Heidegger says, if you read my stuff, you're going to find the ethics in it. In that there's a difference between just being in the world. There's a difference between being there, being present, being sort of a rational actor. Yeah. And then there's a difference between being a rational actor and realizing the rationality of those around you. Actually, like, understanding others as being others. Yeah. Others as beings. Yeah. It's not only that I have sein, it's you have sein. And if I'm being there, Dasein, and you're being there, Dasein, we're being there together. Yeah. That it's now sort of that kingdom of ends idea that he pulls from Kant.
So would Kant be considered one of the first phenomenologists, or maybe a proto-phenomenologist?
So it's generally not believed that, but there's a growing. There's actually a book out there called Kant the First Phenomenologist, where somebody makes the argument that phenomenology only happened because Kant proposed a lot of these ideas, and I have to agree with that on some level. I don't think he intended the field of phenomenology, but I do, given the whole field of phenomenology and how it can be traced directly back to Kant. Yeah. I do somewhat agree with that position.
Yeah. So that being there with others is kind of like the kingdom of ends.
It's essentially, if you can understand other people as like their own rational person, operating not exactly the same as you, but sort of being in the present with one another, it's somewhat the same idea.
Yeah, and like I'm trying to recall my Heidegger, but this is the way in which he's Heidegger was a big critiquer of modernity, in that especially like during the industrial age, doesn't he have an essay on technology?
Yeah.
One of my favorite
Really?
essays, the question concerning technology. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I feel like from what you've been saying that it really, I can kind of see the glimpses of what Heidegger is trying to say for all of that.
The big portion of that essay is essentially the concept that as technology grows, we kind of treat technology, resources become less and less static. So if you have an axe, a tree becomes the entirety of your resource, but as you grow in industrial strength, the tree is no longer a factor, it's the forest.
I see.
So you literally you're missing the forest for the trees.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
But it's more that if your technological capability goes up, you deal less and less with the minute details.
I see.
Sort of aggregate more property as just resources to use at any given point. Because if you're cutting down a single tree, you still see the forest as its own thing. But if the forest becomes something you can cut down, that's just a resource on standby, I believe is the term he uses. And when it comes to the industrial age, he saw humans sort of being put in that category.
Yeah.
You're no longer a worker. It's, hey, we got a factory. We lost 2 workers to an accident, whatever. We have 40 more over there. People become resources on standby.
So just like as a quick shortcut, would this entire project of Heidegger's on technology, would this kind of be like a reevaluation of different types of beings then? Like I prefer this being to me is more valuable than like a multiplicity of.
Yeah, he very much was trying to argue against like the dehumanization that was happening with the industrial age. Funny enough, he's almost entirely parallel with Marx's alienation idea.
Okay.
I say funny enough.
Fun.
I say funny enough because whenever I talk to like hardline Marxists about it, they're like,
sure.
"Oh, but he was a Nazi," and I go,
Oh yeah.
"Guys, it's generally the same idea in that the more technology grows, the more people get alienated from their own work."
I see.
Which,
Interesting. That's very cool.
one of the few things I'm pretty okay with Marx on.
Okay.
Everything else can go show it.
Okay.
So that's actually one of the reasons why I agree with you that the project Kant is trying to present of the kingdom of ends doesn't actually have a dark undertone to it, at least when we apply it to the political framework of the world, I guess. But I think it's becoming more and more implausible as technology advances and the world progresses.
I think where I get a little when it comes to Kant is that he kind of modeled his kingdom of ends on the concept of the kingdom of God, and this is where I like Nietzsche coming in and going like, you just snuck Christianity back into this whole project.
You like it when when Nietzsche enters the cage fight for this particular.
So that's actually one of the questions I have when I read Kant. One of the questions I ask myself when I read anything basically is, okay, why is this person writing? Why do they feel the need of writing this? So I guess this is a question I can throw out there. Like, do you think Kant is trying to rebuild, deconstruct Christianity? Is the moral law just God's command? Is the kingdom of ends the kingdom of heaven? Or are those parallels undue?
I don't necessarily think that he's trying to do anything like that. I think that he says somewhere in the Groundwork that that there are no laws but what we rational beings give to ourselves. Those are the moral laws, and so it's not as if there's commandments coming from somebody else, from somewhere else, or from some other rational being, that I'm not giving myself. So I think when Joey said that there might be some dark side to this kingdom of ends, what you mean is like there might be something kind of authoritarian about it, utopian, like a utopian, an authoritarian, like a socially involved utopia,
Okay.
where people are expected by the whole community to conform to certain laws and rules and maxims.
Okay.
I think that once again the kingdom of ends is like an ideal. So as an ideal, there are obviously things pushing back against it. That is inevitably going to push back against it. So if we think of the kingdom of ends as just rational beings only being rational, then obviously that can't be achieved. Although there is a footnote here on page 86 where he says morals considers a possible kingdom of ends as a kingdom of nature. So from a moral point of view, this kingdom of ends is part of nature. So maybe when we consider it as part of nature, it is achievable.
I see.
And so we can have this dark utopian kingdom of ends where the whole community forces everyone to be rational.
Sort of Snowpiercer.
Yeah, but I mean,
good intentions, but look at how that turned out.
Yeah, I mean, most of the reason people do bad things is because of inclinations.
I will say, when it comes to the question of whether he's deconstructing or constructing Christianity, I think that's more a question of like what was going on at the time, because I think at that point there was a massive. Newton was a very devout Christian, sometimes to apparently heretical.
Yeah,
precepts.
Guy overzealous.
Yeah, he had some wacko notes in there,
Yeah.
but I don't think Newton was planning to introduce new concepts into science that essentially like broke down why the Leibniz-Clark letters even happened in the first place. Of like, hey, this physical reality doesn't fit like pure determinism in sort of a Christian sense, and that sort of produced anxiety within the Christian world. So I don't know if it was that Kant specifically set out to deconstruct Christianity, but that the environment around him was already in a period of time of sort of anxious Christianity.
Yeah.
I mean Hume, right? Like, I mean, I feel like I always have this picture of Kant like furiously reading like through Hume, and he's like, wait a second, and then he just closes himself inside a room for 10 years. But I mean, here's the thing: when I'm talking about kind of the darker side of the kingdom of ends, well, I am kind of in my mind, I am thinking a bit of Nietzsche, and I don't really want to do like an entire Nietzschean critique on Kant, because I feel like we should give him a chance to talk. But it's this thing right here. I believe I sent this like a couple of months ago, but it was Nietzsche talking, or it was Deleuze talking about. He was comparing the eternal recurrence of Nietzsche's versus the categorical imperative of Kant's, and Deleuze compares the categorical imperative. You can only will a maxim if you would will it to be a universal law for everyone, right? But this sort of action, this sort of mindset produces like a hesitancy of action. It's kind of where you're not like fully involved inside the world at that time. Whereas Nietzsche's eternal recurrence could be like equalized into a categorical imperative of whatever you will, realize that you're going to do it for eternity. And so you better be interested in what you're doing in the world.
Little note about his eternal recurrence, because I noticed it got brought up a couple times. Yeah, well, in the podcast, the previous ones, you guys were talking about it. He actually thought it was like. So at the time, there was a scientific hypothesis that the universe, because at this point people were starting to figure out the universe might be finite.
Yeah.
And if the universe is finite, what happens? Does it go on forever? Does it do this? This is well before many of the modern cosmological.
Sure.
One of the hypotheses was that the universe was just infinitely existing and that it would repeat itself.
I see.
Because matter was finite. There are only so many configurations of matter.
Yeah.
And so at some point, you're like this state that the universe is in right now will just occur again because of how math works. Apparently, Nietzsche was a big fan of that one. So his eternal recurrence is not only metaphorical. He had like scrawls of mathematics within notebooks.
Oh, really?
Where he was trying to figure out, is this actually a thing? And he believed that the universe would repeat.
Yeah, he had just one thing real quick, two things real quick. The one he had a couple of those things. I forget which. It was like a different theory about like how animals change. It wasn't evolution. I forget exactly what it was called, but
Wait, humans?
No, I'm talking about Nietzsche, as it concerns that. He had a couple of those things, but back to like the eternal recurrence versus categorical imperative and how that what that has to do with the kingdom of ends is that the kind of the view that I have is I'm looking at people who would be making like universal maxims versus people who are making particular maxims, I suppose you might say. And it's like, okay, well, these two groups are not going to be very, like, if you mash them together, they're going to be resistant to each other. And so that's why I'm like, this idea of the kingdom of ends, universalizing maxims, it's not just a mere integration of these ones who would like particularism. It's a seizing of the will by reason that it is necessary to happen. And so that's why I say this is a darker aspect of like Kantian ethics.
Well, it is the general genealogy thing that Nietzsche brought up. Is many times when you're dealing with the moral system, the question is who put forward the moral system.
Yeah.
And usually, if you can answer that, you have a better answer than actually what the morals are suggesting. So while Kant, certainly we could say that Kant came up with something that probably could have been perfect morals. It's who decides the maxims that are to be universalized, which is the major critique that Nietzsche brought up.
Well, speaking of that, in the general introduction to the Cambridge book that we read, some of us read, the on page XXXI, it says, in the Metaphysics of Morals, however, right is presented as prior to ethics. This would seem to imply that the principle of right is independent of the categorical imperative. So that in that passage, the writers of the general introduction are comparing the groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals to the Metaphysics of Morals. So someone might call Kant's ethics a mere formalism, but then he has this doctrine of right, which develops, ideas like, what is right, and that's in the Metaphysics of Morals.
Yeah, the Metaphysics of Morals is split into two distinct parts. The first part deals with sort of the legal aspects of the categorical imperative. How do we then figure this out with legal and political system to a degree of like natural rights versus given rights?
Yeah, and that gets back into what you were saying about like how does the categorical imperative integrate into political systems?
Yeah, most of that is Kant gives his answer in Metaphysics of Morals, which I know was kind of outside the reading list.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there's so much more to read about Kant, like especially for like what is enlightenment. That was one that I was really hoping to get to. There's lots of Kant that would be very interesting because I think as like a voice of the Enlightenment, I would prize him pretty highly as far as that goes. But I had this particular question concerning just the whole of Kantian ethics, which is, okay, so you have Kant, but you also have the post-Kantians who try to marry together spirit and like the sensual, like they tried to bridge this divide.
The Romantics and the Idealists. There were actually two groups of post-Kantians. There were the idealists, the German idealists, and the Romantics, and then there were a group called the Neo-Kantians whose approach to Kant was more psychological and more empirical. Right. Jacob Fries was one of the early Neo-Kantians, and he had this whole interpretation of the Critique of Pure Reason that was purely psychological, and that relates to A.J. Ayer and the logical positivists. They had this purely psychological interpretation of the Critique of Pure Reason. It's just human psychology that does this. That basically reduces Immanuel Kant down to David Hume, because Hume had this idea of we have this psychological need to associate a cause with an effect, and we assume that that's in nature, but it's not. So it kind of undoes what Kant was trying to do, this interpretation, and brings him down to empiricism.
Well, what I was trying to get at here was that for a lot of these people after Kant, they're trying to say on how the world is like developing. It's in a dialectical process to get to a certain place. Yeah, like Hegel. That's who I'm thinking of primarily right now. But I'm thinking about like where Kant kind of, to me, he seems to like put a stake in the ground and say, um, uh, the dictates of the moral law are available to us here and now. But you have somebody like Hegel who's saying like these processes are still unfolding, and there will. I'm not I'm not exactly versed on Hegelian thought yet, but just from my immediate I guess I would think that it's like, okay, well that means that ethics then is still something that's developing, and it may reach a place, but it still hasn't yet. So what I'm saying is like, what do you guys think of this idea of, well, of where ethics still has a chance to develop, or like the idea that Kant is kind of tying a stake and saying, okay, at this point in history, we do have access to the moral, or yeah,
The moral law.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like to me, it seems like Kant's entire like epistemological project may be for naught if somebody comes along and says, well, noumenon and phenomenon, those two will eventually like join in such a way to where there's no contradictions. So this is I think Hegel's big critique of Kant's antinomies, is where he's like saying, yeah, they're contradicting right now, but eventually our concepts will unfold in such a way to where there will be no contradiction. And so what I'm saying is, like, Kantian ethics seem to take a stand in history and say we have access here and now, but Hegelian, or like somebody that says these processes are still unfolding, we have yet to know for certain. I'm not sure what Hegel's like, if he even discusses like an ethics with this in mind. I was just saying what you guys were thinking about that.
He did have an essay on the development of the concept of right,
Oh, did he?
which goes back to the metaphysics of morals. So if you the way I think of it is like maybe the metaphysics of morals and Kant's notion of right is in his time, and then the groundwork is kind of timeless because it's about all rational beings, which includes rational beings now, rational beings in the past, and rational beings in the future. So there is a timelessness to the groundwork, and then maybe there is not a timelessness to the metaphysics of morals, and maybe that was what the German idealists would develop, is this idea of, well, what is right, and how does right develop, and how does our conception of these things develop?
I guess what I'm saying is that timelessness too is subject, or like to somebody with a more dialectical process. I'm saying that timelessness is also subject to, like, it's a particular point, but it has yet to resolve. So it's Kant may say it's timeless, but it's not.
So, but
Hegel also said it was timeless.
Oh, did he?
Yeah.
well, but I mean it's timeless because it's the whole point is well, this applies universally to all rational beings. So a moral law applies universally, consistently to all rational beings. So how could you then say, well, a rational being in the future or somewhere else with a different nature, it doesn't apply to them? I mean, it by definition applies. That's what the whole point of the categorical imperative is.
Okay.
Did we bring up the self-consciousness as part of the historical dialectic?
No.
Not yet.
To be honest, Hegel in the future, but
Yeah.
We'll get to him, but
Yeah, the big addition that Hegel gave was that he, as you guys were saying, put him in a historical context. But it was a big portion of that was that Kant sort of served as not the real, but the best example of like explaining self-consciousness coming from epistemology, and then Hegel kind of went backwards in like, where do we see this popping up in history? And so he saw Kant as sort of the latest of explaining self-consciousness coming through history.
Oh yeah, that's an old idea in German philosophy. This idea of self-consciousness, and that's what makes something more spirit. So it's like an inert stone is less spirit because it's less self-conscious, whereas you are more spirit because you're more self-conscious. And then, human beings are more spirit.
You said the next one you'd want to go over is Schopenhauer.
Yes.
You'll see that pop up a lot.
I know Marx got brought up. If you're interested in a book about Marx, Isaiah Berlin's biography of Karl Marx, the first or second chapter is about the philosophy of the spirit. You know, this pre-Hegelian philosophy of the spirit that was developed and used by both Hegel and eventually by Marx. But this also relates to this like early modern 17th century idea that you find in Milton, where everything is matter, everything is made of matter, and what makes something, except for God is spirit, and what makes something more or less spirit is like proximity to God. So the angels in heaven are more spirit, and then when they come down and visit Adam and Eve, they're like men, they're matter. You know, Milton has that idea, and he uses that idea in his poetry. And so there's like the 17th century precursor to this idea of the philosophy of spirit, where spirit is a gradient,
I see.
on a gradient with matter. Yeah.
Gotcha.
So
Interesting.
yeah.
Well, were there any like big topics that we want to cover in what we've gone through in groundwork or practical reason, just broadly?
But I got a fun one. What sort of like fictional movie story do you think perfectly captures Kantian ideas?
King of the Hill.
King of the Hill?
King of the Hill. Yeah, because he's like,
Sure.
oh man, there's this one clip of where he's making like Bobby smoke some cigarettes, and he's like, "You're holding it like a Nazi," and Bobby's like, well, what does it matter how I hold it like? And he's like, now that's no way to think. If you're going to do something, what is it? Even if you're doing something wrong, you better be doing it right. Yeah, the right way or something like that. And it's like there's this other scene of where he's chasing this guy through the building, and the guy goes out and exit, and it says like emergency only, and he's like, dang it, and he goes back out the building because he can't go out the exit. So that was the first thing that hopped into my mind. But,
Sure.
What do you guys think?
I got a weird one with Batman.
Okay.
Batman has one maxim.
Oh.
He has no maxims. Like, all else is permitted. Obviously, because he's dealing with people who do not operate on like any maxim except their own inclinations.
Yeah.
But he comes along and he goes, "I've got one rule, and I'm going to enforce this rule so hard."
Yeah. Wow.
I mean, if you were to enforce it in the kingdom of Fence Kant wants you to live in, I guess, you would need to follow it that hard. The thing is, Batman is only following that maxim, and he has inclinations. In the kingdom of Fence, you would get rid of all inclination.
That's where I find him
And-
kind of interesting.
yeah.
It's like how much of what he does is actually inclinations. If his whole thing
I
is
guess
like,
a lot.
I've got these murderers over here, I want them to stop. I'm allowed to break their bones. I'm allowed to do all sorts of horrible stuff, but I can't kill, and I don't want them to kill. He's a weird enforcement of I've got one maxim. Everyone must follow it.
Interesting. I was just thinking of The Dark Knight, though, the ending of the one with the Joker, where he's like, they preserve the noble lie, though. Like, maybe, but it's like, I don't know.
So another example I have is a fictionalized version of a real guy, Frank Serpico. His whole thing was he was a police officer, plainclothes police officer in the 1970s in New York City, and his whole thing is don't take bribes, and he expects he refuses bribes, and he expects the other officers not to take bribes, and he goes throughout the movie, and he's reporting it again and again to the higher ups, and nobody's doing anything. But don't take bribes, I guess, is a good example of like a Kantian maxim, and he was treating it like one, where he wouldn't take bribes. He didn't want the other beat cops to take bribes, and in the end, he gets shot by a fellow police officer, and he has a rant about how the beat cops would be held responsible, but the higher ups would not be.
Have I seen that scene before? I don't know. That sounds some familiar. But
So yeah, that Frank Serpico's maxim of "don't take bribes," he was treating it like a Kantian moral law.
Well, it's kind of interesting because there's no such thing as like in fiction a perfect Kantian person, because ultimately that person would be boring. There would be no story.
There would be news.
But you could find examples of like you have a character where they have one rule, and it's not just they have one rule. It's that they attempt to universalize that rule among everything within their world.
yep, lawful good. Lawful good.
But it also seems that the perfect Kantian person could only exist if everyone is a perfect Kantian person.
That's another thing. Yeah, the whole thing with Kingdom of Ends is that if you get somebody who's no longer operating like that, it very quickly falls apart.
Well, yeah, from the point of view of the groundwork, we're both, each rational being is both intelligible and sensible, or at least human beings are. Yeah. So as a sensible person, you're not obeying the moral laws, you're acting maybe in accordance with the moral laws, but you're not acting out of the moral laws.
Yeah.
And just being sensible, you're not a perfect, maybe Kantian moral rational will.
Yeah.
The perfect will is one that always that's a perfect will by definition, and therefore always acts out of respect for the moral law.
Oh, and yeah, before that, what Eric was saying just now reminds me of a correction I wanted to make earlier. You guys were talking about people being sovereigns of the Kingdom of Ends, or being sovereigns of this rational community. Kant says that at least with that term sovereign, we need to be very careful, because no rational being can actually be a sovereign in the Kingdom of Ends, only a member. And I think one of the reasons he mentions that, I don't have it with the quote right now, but it's that a sovereign would have unlimited resources and would not need duty, because duty is a necessity of the action to act according to the moral law.
Right.
But the sovereign would not need to do that.
Yeah.
They already do that.
I guess that would be the holy will.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Although we do kind of act in the Kingdom of Ends, we do kind of act like sovereigns in that we make laws that ourselves and everyone else follows.
And
There's
yeah.
a particular portion in section 1 that I had to read and reread because I don't know if what he's talking about here actually mimics a sociopath. Says still further, if nature had put little sympathy in the heart of this or that man, if in other respects an honest man, he is by temperament cold and indifferent to the sufferings of others, perhaps because he himself is provided with a special gift of patience and endurance towards his own sufferings and presupposes the same in every other, or even requires it. If nature had not properly fashioned such a man, who would in truth not be its worst product, for a philanthropist, would he not still find within himself a source from which to give himself a far higher worth than by what a mere good-natured temperament might have? And then it was this portion where I was like, what? By all means, it is just then the worth of character comes out, which is moral and incomparably the highest, namely that he is beneficent not from inclination but from duty. So there was a portion there where it's like, wait, so if a sociopath does something good,
It's still good.
it's still good, but is he like kind of putting that higher because they don't even have the inclination?
That's exactly it, actually. Before the quote you recited just now, he says, does the action without any inclination simply from duty, then the action first has its genuine moral worth. So he actually seeks to remove all inclination, all feeling, all sense experience.
There's a portion that portion,
and that's inversely proportional to moral worth.
Let's say you go and you help somebody in need, and 90% of that is just this is something I should do, but 10% of that is I like helping people, it makes me feel good. And then somebody comes along and they're like, I don't feel anything for other humans, and then they do the same
but they do
thing because of duty. Is that 10% of that makes me feel good? Would Kant say that person is actually less moral?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of his examples when he's talking about duty, right? Which is the misanthropic philanthropist. Yeah. Which is, he may be like totally disgusted with people, but if he acts,
not disgusted, but
if he acts from duty, though, he still behaved according to the moral law.
I think I look at it more positively, where you can talk about your inclinations and you can put doubt into why you're doing something. But the point of Kantian ethics is that when we say someone does something good, we mean it. We're not implying any inclination. We're not pointing to any inclination. We're not saying they're a good person. We're saying they did something good. So in that example that Verity was giving, that's not a good person. But it doesn't matter. If they did something good, they did something good. It doesn't matter. Their character doesn't matter. If they do something good, they did something good.
Yeah. Well, if you do the action because of inclination, would Kant care, or is it just he cares that the majority of the reason behind it was from duty?
I would say that by fixating on your particular inclinations, you're kind of undermining yourself. Because if you're helping people, you're helping people, and if you're focused on, well, I'm just doing this for a selfish reason, that's obviously selfish. You might also have a selfish reason, but that's not why you're doing it. You're doing it because it's a good thing to do, and credit to you for doing it.
So it's as long as the selfish reason, the inclination is secondary to the actual duty, you think Kant would essentially look at that as just the same as a moral action from somebody with no inclination.
The thing is, he would call that praiseworthy, commendable. Yeah. He would recommend it. He would say you should keep doing it. It's a quote-unquote good thing to do, but only as praise. But when it comes to moral content, whatever he means by moral content, he would say it doesn't have any moral content.
Or moral worth.
Moral worth, yeah, thank you. It's not a morally good action, it's a recommendable, praiseworthy action.
But think about it like somebody who's struggling, mentally, who's like, am I a good person? Do I do good things? And if they do good things, but then fixate on maybe possible selfish motives, that's bad for their mental health. So if you think about it, the Kantian view is just, if you do something good and you do it because you know it's a good thing to do, then you did something that has moral worth. You don't need to say, well, I possibly did this because I have this inclination. I mean, you may have the inclination, but the point is you did something because it was good. You don't need to be pulling the moral worth out of your actions by assuming that you're selfish. Yeah, so and he says something, I don't know where, and I think it's in the practical, in the second critique, the critique of practical reason, about how human beings are really good at moral reasoning, and they're really good at being cynics and finding the selfishness, finding the inclination. But that's just them being aware of the true nature of morality. The true nature of morality is to do things because they're good. And by being cynical and saying that there's some selfish aspect to it, we're just being cynical. We're not really making observations. We're speculating because we know that selfishness removes the moral worth of an action. Yeah. But yeah, you have to think. So one of my favorite philosophers is Sextus Empiricus, who's an ancient skeptic. His whole deal was you memorize a bunch of arguments from a bunch of different philosophers. And he was writing in the
sophistry.
3rd century. Well, it wasn't even sophistry. It was just, well, you have an argument. If somebody is really convinced by a certain argument that something is true, the skeptic can say, and it bothers them. If they're convinced by an argument that something is true, and that belief that they now have bothers them, the skeptic can come with his opposing argument, his equally strong opposing argument, and say, well, consider this. And then suddenly the person who was convinced by that argument has to suspend judgment, and they're no longer bothered by that belief that they had. And so there is kind of this therapeutic aspect. And with Kant's ethics and the groundwork, especially, you can think of that as it's therapeutic. It's in the Kantian ethics point of view, you don't have to worry about if you're a good person to do good things. If you do a good thing, you did a good thing. If anyone does a good thing, they do a good thing. You don't have to speculate on inclinations or or the type of person someone is. You just acknowledge good. You just respect the good. You respect the moral law, and that's it.
That's not the feeling I got from Kant, though, because he spends a lot of time talking about the same action from inclination is less worth than an action from duty. Which from duty he's talking in German. Flight. I'm terrible with German. I gotta learn German at some point. First my Russian, then we get to German. It's specifically a German word that denotes moral duty versus, I think it's Abschiss. For anybody out there who knows German, I'm terribly sorry. But there's two words for duty. There's duty implicating moral duty, like some higher duty, versus duty as in like a job or a typical family responsibility, something you're expected to do over the course of your daily life. And he specifically denotes we're talking about this duty. So, and he says if you're working from this duty, this action is good, but if you do so entirely from inclinations, because you want praise or you want to feel good or because experience just told you to do this, then it's not a moral good.
Well, think about it as like a contrapositive. So it's like you have a hypothetical proposition, like if you do this, if you do something from inclination, then that action has no moral worth. Well, the contrapositive of that is if the action has moral worth, then you didn't do it from inclination. And these statements are that hypothetical and its contrapositive are equivalent. So if I judge someone to do something good, I'm saying they're not doing it from inclination. If they come back to me and say, well, actually I did it from inclination, I can say, well, you think you did it from inclination. You might fixate on your selfish motives, but in my view, you did something good, which means you did it for the right reason, and that's the right reason is just because it was good, because it was a good thing to do. So I mean, what you were saying was like what you were saying was like oh, he has a different idea of moral duties versus just regular duties.
Well, yeah, because the a priori is a set goodwill.
Yeah,
it's like is the end goal.
It's like keeping kosher. It's like you're keeping the moral duties away from the duties that are just jobs or out of obligation.
Yeah.
But I'd say that if it seems to be up to code, that it's kosher basically. That's I think what Kant was getting at. Is you can doubt yourself, but you don't need to. That's the point. You know, if he's keeping kosher, he's keeping obligations away from duties. He's keeping things done out of obligation, or things done out of obligation. And what's his thing about obligation? He says if you do it out of obligation if it's according to the moral law, but not because of the moral law, right? That's something done out of inclination. He's trying to keep these actions done from inclination separate from actions done out of respect from the moral law. But then from a certain point of view, there's only a difference if you acknowledge it as such. If you insist that it is such, there is a difference.
Yeah, because he does make a distinction between actions that are in accordance with the moral law, but those actions can still be from inclination, and actions that are from the moral law, or from duty, I should say.
But you never need to assume, you never need to unnecessarily say it's from inclination. You know, if it's from inclination, then you know it is for certain. If you're not certain, then there's a possibility it's not from inclination. It's just out of respect for the moral law. So speaking of that, I'm reading this book, Anscombe. I don't know how to pronounce her name. She was a student of Wittgenstein. I'm reading this book called Intention. And she talks about, like, what does it mean to do something intentionally? And she has this thing about two types of knowledge. You know, you have knowledge based on observation, what you observe to be true, and then what you intend. And these are two separate forms of knowledge. And her thing is like, well, what does it mean for an action to be intentional? It means when you ask why that was done, there's certain specific answers, like from the history of the person, from what they're trying to accomplish, or just a description.
Yeah.
Like why are they, like why is somebody so like if somebody's carrying a watering can, you can ask, well, why are they carrying that watering can? And someone can describe it's like, well, they're going to pour water on the flowers outside. That's a description of what they're going to do. And that's an example of an intentional action, that carrying the watering can to water flowers. And how does this get back into Kant? Well, it's like we can think of like moral action as like being intentional. Like, what are you intending to do? If you're intending to respect the moral law, then your action has moral worth.
Your will is correctly aligned to the right end.
Yes.
The end in itself.
And getting back to Verity's answer, if he's helping people, because he knows that it's right, it's the right thing to do, but then he's like, well, but I also kind of get a pleasure out of it, then his intention wasn't to get the pleasure; it was to help people. And so, and that goes going back to Kant, moral worth.
Yeah.
And
I think more his example was like if you're a politician and you like donate to a charity because it looks good for your campaign. He would condemn that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I think it's also more interesting in that I don't know where he would put that line of like, well, as long as you're doing it mostly for this, he would be okay.
Well, he
Because
wouldn't. He's trying to keep it kosher. He's trying to keep the obligations away from out of respect for duty. He's trying to keep actions from obligations away from actions out of respect for duty. But then at the same time, if something is kosher, then if you know something, if other people are sure it's kosher, if the rabbi is sure it's kosher, if all the rabbis are sure it's kosher, you don't need to say, well, it might not be kosher. Then maybe to use like an example.
And Hume enters the ring.
Well, just wrapping up, there was this kind of along this same line here. It's I think is it near the end of Practical Reason where he's talking about how happiness is confused as the motive for doing the good will. It's like where because
It's in Groundwork as well.
Is it in Groundwork?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, he's talking about how the harmonization of the faculties it creates this contentment, but as mere mortals, we feel this happiness as a result. And so many times, what happens is people get confused and say that this empirical sensation is like the motivator for our actions, but really it's the alignment of the faculties according to reason in accordance with the good will, which chords struck, and so that's one of his big thing, and that's a big thing against like the empiricism that's confused as the cause of action.
Yeah, empiricists had this idea. I think it was just Francis Hutcheson. This idea of like moral feeling, and that's what makes morality is this feeling that you have. And Kant's thing is the feeling is produced after. It's not a motivator. It's the satisfaction we get out of doing what's our duty.
Yeah, I think he was specifically referencing Locke, John Locke, when it came to the happiness aspect. At least that's the one he names.
Really?
Yeah, in Groundwork he specifically says Locke, which at that point it was John Locke.
Oh, okay.
And then obviously like Hume does talk about that, of his ethical premise of, whatever, pleasure. I don't think, Mill was after, wasn't it? Yeah, Mill was.
Mill was a Victorian, yeah.
Yeah. I thought of Mill because I know that Mill actually wrote in his utilitarianism, he said that Kant tries to be somebody who establishes a rule, but at the end of it, he still becomes a consequentialist, because the only way to universalize a rule is to understand how it would, what the consequences would be, and to judge those consequences.
Well, but for Kant, the consequences are inconsistency. That's just a logical consequence. That's not a bad consequence.
Essential consequence.
Yeah, it's not like consequence like jaywalking. You might suffer the consequence of getting hit by a car. The consequence for Kant is just inconsistency. It's like maybe the law is bad if not everyone can follow it, or if you can't follow it consistently yourself.
I think that's certainly he seems to put some idea into consequence when he's dealing with the axe murderer at the door. example, if you guys are familiar with that one.
Oh yes,
I
yes.
am.
Uh huh.
Where he's acts. His friend comes to his place, says, "You gotta hide me. There's this guy after me." And then his friend is hiding out in the house. Guy knocks on the door. He goes to the door. Dude's holding an axe and says, "Where the f*** is your friend?
Yeah.
I'm going to kill him."
Right.
And then Kant is essentially given the proposition by somebody else, like, would you lie in that situation? If you want to universalize lying, could you create a maxim in which lying in this situation would actually be good because, your friend gets to live? And Kant actually says, no, because I can't universalize lying. If I universalize lying even for this instinct, then what happens in the situation where I tell the lie of, no, he's not home, and then he goes around, and the consequence is his friend actually got out the back door.
Yeah.
Now he's morally culpable. Whereas if he says yes, and his friend is in the house, he's not morally culpable. Kant looks at it in that aspect. So there is the two aspects. Bill tends to focus on, well, you had to go over the consequence. Obviously, you're dealing with consequentialism on some level, which obviously there's plenty to criticize him there. But no, yeah, Kant is talking about if I lie, I've taken on the moral burden of lying, and thus any consequences that come from that are my fault. Whereas if I tell the truth, I've aligned myself with the will, and therefore anything that happens as a consequence is from their will, not mine.
Well, guys, I think that ought to do it for now. We're about to get kicked out here pretty soon. But thanks, guys, for coming. This was great, and it was nice having you here too, Verity. You're about to skip town. Yeah, but thanks for joining us, everybody, and we will see you again next time.
See ya.
Bye.